We'll lower this a little bit. But good morning. It's great to be with you here this morning. I don't come here every week. Like, I come here about once a month. I get asked to come preach, and then other times I get asked to preach at other churches. So I don't always get to be here. So some of you might be here every week except the weeks I'm here, and so that's why I haven't met you. And some of you might be new visiting for the first time or just one small visit. But I'm so excited that there's several of you here that I haven't met before. So welcome to Angola Church. We're really glad you're here. For whatever reason you're here, whether you moved here recently or just visiting people in the area, but whatever the reason you're here, super glad. Looking forward to meeting you after the church service today. So I know that I look like a person who was probably really normal as a child, but I wasn't. I was a very strange child. And one of the strangest nights of my life was September 4, 2003. I remember the exact date, not because September 4 is super important to me, but because September 5 is really important because that's my birthday. And in 2003, I was turning 13 years old. And for those of you who are good at math, you can now figure out how old I am now. But that was such a strange night because I was visiting my grandparents down in Texas on my mom's side, and there wasn't enough beds for everyone, so I always slept on the couch when we went to visit Grandma and Grandpa. And it was a hot summer night because every night all year round in Texas is a hot summer night. And so as I laid awake on the couch thinking, I was like, wow, tomorrow I turn 13. I'm no longer a child. I'll be a man tomorrow. No longer a child. My childhood is over. I'm old tomorrow. And in my mind, I was skipping right from being a 12-year-old child to becoming an old man overnight. And so I went from being really excited about turning 13 to, as the night went on, as I had a hard time falling asleep, I started becoming depressed. I'm like, wow, kids are the ones who don't have responsibilities. They're the ones who get to have fun in life. Adults, they have responsibilities. They have to work. They have to provide. They have to make sure everything happens. They have errands to run and chores to do. I have chores as a kid, but not as much. I'm going to be old. And so I was depressed for the next few days, and what should have been an exciting day of turning 13, I was just depressed all day, depressed for the next few days. And it's kind of a ridiculous story, right? I mean, you're not actually an old man when you turn 13. You're still, you're in that weird in-between where you're kind of a kid, kind of an adult. You're transitioning in between the two. But I think there is something relatable about that, right? That idea that, sometimes we feel what if I've already peaked in life? And sometimes we get worried, what if the biggest, best, most exciting, important parts of my life are all in the past? What if the best version of who I am as a person is gone? And sometimes we just get that idea, and sometimes people play into this. I mean, there's so many products out there where the pitch is buy this to feel, stay, look young. Or you hear politicians talk about things like the country used to be great, now we need to be great again, but somehow we've lost that. Or we used to be normal, but now anymore, now there's chaos, and now we need to get back to being normal. And you hear these ideas, and there's this fear we have sometimes of what if the best is gone? What if all we have left to look forward to is the worst parts of life? Whether as individuals or groups of people, it's something we worry about. And today we're going to be looking at a story in the book of John. If you want to follow along, it's in John chapter 2. Thanks, Mark, or Jeremy, for reading that for us today. I was expecting it to be Mark, but you did it instead, Jeremy. Thank you. But John chapter 2, the Gospel of John, of course, is this account about the life of Jesus written by one of his close followers named John. So John chapter 2, starting in verse 1. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. The third day, this is significant because, it's the third day of what? Well, it's the third day after the stuff that happened in John 1, which is the story of how he starts to first call his disciples to follow him. And so now we're like, okay, 3 days later, this is very early on. This is the end of like their first week together, because he spends about 3 or 4 days getting his disciples together. And now 3 days later, they're off to a wedding. And what's interesting is the third day is also significant because it ties into other stories in the Bible that something significant happens on the third day. One of the biggest ones it connects to is there's a story in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, where Abraham is told by God, hey, go sacrifice Isaac on a mountain. And God intervenes and prevents Abraham from actually sacrificing his son Isaac. But it was that third day when Isaac was saved and it was a lamb sacrificed in his place. And so somehow this story is meant to connect to that story. Somehow this is going to be a story that connects to the idea of death in someone else's place, and ultimately pointing forward to the death and resurrection of Jesus. This is also significant because it's happening in Cana. They're going to a wedding, and whose wedding is it? No one's. Or not no one's, but there's no name for this couple given. I'm sure they literally had a name, but their name's not important. This is not a significant couple. This is not someone who's viewed as being important. This is a relatively unimportant couple because we don't know their names. And Cana, this is the only time in the Gospel of John where Cana is specifically mentioned. I believe I couldn't find any other spots in the entire Bible where Cana is mentioned specifically by name. This is not a very important town. This is an unimportant couple in an unimportant town. And the region of Galilee was known for kind of being that part of the country that was uneducated, unsophisticated, where people kind of had a bit of an accent that was different from the rest of the country. Kind of like how we view the South sometimes. That's how people from Galilee were viewed, kind of like, oh, they have kind of dumb accents. They're not sophisticated and cool like people from other places. And so if you were the person in charge, if Jesus had decided to go to a company and be like, hey, you're going to launch my ministry for me. You're in charge of coming up with the biggest, best event to launch my ministry. You would get fired at that company if this was your plan. And yet there's something about this that's so perfect and yet so unexpected. Sometimes in life, the things that we expect God to do or the things we think God should do things in a certain way, and he doesn't do it that way, we're tempted to get disappointed. But his way always ends up being something better, something that ends up being more profound than our ideas of what would look profound. Continuing in verse 3, and when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. Now, I don't know if you've ever been at a party and they run out of food or drink, and it's kind of embarrassing. You don't want to be that host that runs out of food or drink, and everyone's kind of hungry or thirsty, and they kind of look at you weird, and they're like, I don't know that I want to go to their house next time they invite me over. They ran out of food. It was awkward. So for us, it's kind of awkward, but for them, it's so much worse because weddings are a huge deal. This is a poor group of people that don't have a lot of extra money to celebrate and do parties all the time. They have the religious feast days they do a handful of times a year, and then when a young couple gets wedding, those are the things they celebrate, and that's about it. So a wedding's a huge deal, and it wasn't just, when we have a wedding now, it's a one-day thing. The planning takes months, but the wedding itself happens in one day. But for them, it was a week-long thing. The wedding and the feasting afterwards would last about a whole week. This was a huge deal, and so for them to run out of wine was a huge deal. It's an embarrassment. And generally speaking, at least according to the stuff I was looking up about this chapter, it was the groom's responsibility to provide the wine. So you're at this wedding, and the wine runs out, and then as soon as the people start to realize this, what's going to happen is the bride's family is going to start looking at that groom and say, I don't know if he's good enough for our daughter, our sister, whatever. He can't make sure there's even enough wine for the wedding. How is he going to provide for her for life? And then the groom, when he finds out, and he's starting to get in trouble for this, he's starting to hear all the people complaining. He's like, I put so-and-so in charge. And so he's blaming the servant that was responsible for the wine, and that guy's job is on the line, and he's all of a sudden freaking out because his job's on the line. And now he's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I was told there's going to be 100 guests. There's 150 guests. I had enough wine for 100 people. I didn't know you were going to bring your second cousin and all of her kids. This isn't my fault. And so the blame game starts, and best case scenario, years later, whenever a problem happens, people look at that couple and be like, at least I wasn't the person who ran out of wine at my own wedding. Worst case scenario, this creates rifts in everyone's relationships, and people permanently sever relationships over the shame and embarrassment of running out of wine at the wedding. This is going to cause a lifetime of shame and guilt for this young couple. This is going to be an awful way to start life together. And so the mother of Jesus, Mary, she comes to him and she tells him about it. When there's this problem, this young couple about to face a lifetime of shame and embarrassment, her solution is to go to Jesus. And that's beautiful. That's powerful. So continuing, so in verse 4, Jesus responds to her. He says, woman, and that's not a derogatory term. This is not in the tone of like, woman, make me a sandwich. But this is more like a term more along the lines of like miss or ma'am. He's being very respectful. He's using a common term of respect for her. But he says, listen, miss, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not come yet. And every time in the Gospel of John where Jesus talks about my hour hasn't come yet, he's talking about his death on the cross. And so basically what he's saying here, to put it in slightly different words, but with the same meaning, is, listen, miss, I'm not sure why you're telling me this problem. It's not my time to die yet. Which is a very strange thing to respond to when someone says we're out of wine. But there's something about this request to save this couple from a life of shame. There's something about this request for more wine that reminds Jesus of his own death. Because while this couple is going to face a life of shame when the wine runs out, but Jesus is being asked to save them from this. When he dies on the cross, he gives us the opportunity to accept the gift of his blood represented by the wine and save us from a life of shame and guilt. So that's why he gives this very strange, on the surface at least, sounding response, but it makes sense and it's profound because he recognizes that, like, when he dies, the blood he sheds will cover the shame of our lives. And that's why this request for more wine reminds him of his own death. And whether or not his mom fully understands what he means by that phrase or not is unclear. At the very least, it's a very strange, cryptic way to respond to her. And so, but in verse 5, she says to the servants, whatever he says to you, do it. Mary gets him. She might not fully understand everything about who he is. She might not fully understand everything about what his mission on life is about. She might not understand that he's talking about his own death when he says, my hour hasn't come yet. But she understands his character. She's watched him grow up. She's watched how he treats people. She knows that he has compassion for people in need, and that when he sees a need and when he's asked to step in and fill that need, he responds. He takes care of things. He's not someone who is going to sit back and join the people making fun of this couple for running out of wine. He's going to do something to save this couple from the embarrassment of running out of wine, regardless of whose fault it is. Continuing in verse 6, now there were 6 water pots of stone according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. Jesus said to them, fill the water pots with water, and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, draw some out now and take it to the master of the feast. And they took it. Water pots, just with ordinary water. This seems unusual. This isn't in the day. This is before the days of like instant Kool-Aid. Like he's not having him fill it up. And he's going to pour some like Kool-Aid mix into it, and like, oh, there's the wine. just ordinary water, but Jesus is about to take the ordinary and make it extraordinary. The creator of the world is about to recreate this water into something else. And we're not told how he does it. We're just told that, like, he says to fill up the water, and then a few verses later it says the water that was turned into wine. And we're never shown or told how he turned it into wine. He just somehow works behind the scenes and makes it happen. And so often in life, it's really hard to see the specifics of how God's working, but when we look back, we can see the results of what he's done. So Jesus says this to them in this water pots of stone, this water, that all this water was used for, it's used for the purification. In other words, it's used to wash your hands and face and maybe your feet. It's going to make you physically clean. But when Jesus interacts with that water, he turns it into wine, and now they're going to be cleansed from shame. A life, like all that water was going to be used for is to make it where your hands were clean to eat. And now it's going to be used to clean them from a life of being outcasts, of broken relationships. Continuing in verse 9, and these servants are about to be part of something beautiful. Like Jesus says, do this. They don't question it. They might have internally been questioning it, but they trust him, and so they do it. And now they're going to get to be part of this miraculous sign. And he said to them, draw some out and take it to the master of the feast, and they took it. Verse 9. When the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, it did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew. The master of the feast called the bridegroom, and he said to them, every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. You have kept the good wine until now. The result of this miraculous sign is seen, even though the miracle itself is unseen. And when the master of the feast says, you have kept the good wine until now, this is the opposite of how so many people do things in life. It's the opposite of how often I do things in life, and maybe how you do things in life sometimes. So much of our life is spent around the idea of putting our best foot forward, making a good impression. We want to nail the job interview, and then so often we do just enough to get by in the job itself. Or we want to do a great job recruiting someone, and then once we've convinced them to join our team, then we're like, okay, well, I'm just going to do enough to make sure you don't leave. And so often this is how people view life, like gotta peak, gotta do things early, gotta nail the first impression. And that's why so many people, they feel like they peaked in high school or early adulthood, and you look back on times of life like, wasn't it cool when I got to hang out with friends and I was young and good looking and got a party and you know, whatever. I was the big guy on campus. I was the popular girl at school. And their life is built on these temporary things that don't actually have lasting meaning in life. But that's not how life is with Jesus. With Jesus, he saves the best for last. And sometimes we're tempted to think that being a follower of Jesus means we miss out on the physical, temporary pleasures of life. That things like food and drink and physical connection and entertainment, that all those things we give it up like we got to go live as monks. But that's not what this story is about. Jesus is at a wedding. He's celebrating the physical and emotional connection and commitment of this young couple. He's at a feast. He's eating with people. When the wine runs out, he fills it up. Like, Jesus isn't someone who's like wanting to take away the pleasures of life, but he's wanting to take those pleasures of life and he's wanting to infuse them with deeper meaning and joy that's lasting. Because Jesus is the creator of all these things, and he's the one who's the recreator who recreates these things back into their original purpose. Because with Jesus, the best is always yet to come. So what about you in your life? Do you allow Jesus to infuse your life with his blessings? What about in your life when you find yourself running out of wine? Is he the one you turn to? When you find yourself with face to face with the consequences of mistakes that have been made, Do you try to find a scapegoat to blame? Do you desperately look around for any excuse of why this isn't your fault? Or do you resign yourself to just I just gotta accept all the shame and guilt, and that's just how it is. I'm just the person who messed up the party, and forever people are going to think of me that way. Or do you bring your problem to Jesus? Are you like Mary and you come to him admitting there's a problem and asking him to work? Asking him to deal with it in some way? Are you like those servants who do whatever Jesus asks, and it doesn't make sense to them why he's asking them to do what he is? How is this going to solve the problem? They're not sure, but because they listen to him, Jesus works through them to solve this problem. Problems come in life, whether it's caused by my mistake or your mistake or unforeseen circumstances. That's not really anyone's fault. It just happened. Problems happen. And when we ignore the problem, or when we try to play the blame game, when we try to solve the problem on our own, we end up like the people who serve the best wine first. And then when it runs out, we're left scrambling and desperate, and oh no, whose fault is this? And the best ends up being early in life, and then we're left in life as we get older. Life starts to get worse, and there's nothing to turn it around for us because we peaked early in life. But when we turn to Jesus, he begins to work in our lives. Sometimes by doing big, flashy miracles, but far more often by working subtly behind the scenes, working in unseen ways, but we can see the results looking back. Jesus is the one who turns the water into wine. He's the one who saves the best for last.